That paradox that I'm talking about, which is both open and presentational at the same time, like a mirror, that paradox is the capital M mystery. And that's on the level of the Or and Sof. It's beyond Keter. There's this term that is used in Hasidus based on technical Lurianic Kabbalah. And I've mentioned this term to you before, tzach-tzach-ot, which literally means the splendors. These are the infinite variations of light beyond the worlds and beyond Keter. Well, it's in that register that we have to reconcile the paradox. And in technical Kabbalah, there are, and you probably know this from, I believe it's Westcott's translation of the Sifra Tzniuta section of the Zohar that he called Kabbalah Unveiled.
Yeah, so, it's Mathers. Yeah,
Mathers. Right. It was Mathers. Right. That is probably the most deeply esoteric book of the Zohar, the Sifra Tzniuta section. It's in a category of literature called the Idrot, Idra Rabbah, Idra Zuta, and Sifra Tzniuta, which is like the most dense symbolism of all. But what it states on the outset is it paints a picture of reality weighed on scales. And the statement is made, there were kings who lived and reigned and then died. So what Lurianic Kabbalists interpret this statement as are primordial worlds that are the precursor to the Hishtalshelus, the order of the worlds that we know and talk about commonly. But all of them is predicated on this scale model, meaning there's a pivot point and two pans of the scale, and there's a hidden equilibrium there that creates a picture of the paradox. And on the most profound primordial level, its openness and presentationality are equalized. If you don't equalize them and dualize them, you end up in habit land. We all know what that produces. But if you reconcile that paradox, you can draw it through every possible level, and it will unmake the prison cells of every stage, right? It's the constant, is the paradox that comes rooted on the deepest and most profound level. That's actually what we fall in love with devotionally in mysticism, is that paradox, which is the paradox of the primordial tzimtzum. It appears contained and immanent and finite, but its true nature is infinite, uncontainable, and transcendent in the extreme. So the two aspects of this paradox, which are involved in what the Lurianic Kabbalists call the primordial worlds of the Tzach-Tzach-Ot, are these principles of tohu and bohu, right? Tohu and bohu ultimately become chokmah and bina, right? But there's so much more than that. It's the link between chokmah and bina and that primordial paradox of the Or and Sof and open presentationality, that we have these two principles. We have tohu, which is translated as chaos. You know, the way it's translated in the Bible is chaos and void, or chaos and, I hate that translation. I think that's a King Jameser right there.
Yeah, chaos in Greek in general, even though it's not translated out of the Greek, but that's the etymological root of that word. It means void. It doesn't mean disorder. It means nothing.
Well, we're not talking about entropy here. We're talking about structurelessness, the undifferentiated, right? Structurelessness, but dynamic structurelessness.
God damn it, David. God damn it. Wow. Okay. Continue.
Okay. So the tohu is this dynamic structurelessness, which is like every possibility at the same time. I mean, think about it. If you couldn't delineate one possibility from another and had them all simultaneously, you would get nothing. Right? Because there would be no limitations or boundaries that could be calculated. So dynamic structureless is the pure mirror-like presentation of the Or Ein Sof without any restrictions whatsoever. So it's translated as chaos because the mind might perceive it that way, but it's not entropy chaos, right? It's pure possibilizing dynamism, pure creativity. That's what your mind actually is. That's the Or of Or Ein Sof.
This is devastating, this stuff right here. I mean, this is incredible. This is so valuable to be able to parse these terms that people are constant. Like, we've based entire theologies off of like such minuscule, such mean understanding of this stuff. This is
Theologically, what is stated in the timeline is a proto-cosmic history where first God creates light, and that light, and I'm oversimplifying here to just make a point, right? The first stage is one big Keter that includes the potential for all the Sphirot in one big Keter. And that's unsustainable because there's no possibility of relationships. The purpose of why a creation would be created from a theological standpoint is not elaboratable. So it breaks and it falls into itself. And the next stage, and these are the kings that died in Edom that are referred to in the Zohar, the kings that died after the scales were presented. And the next stage is the Sphirot are presented, but instead of checks and balances, every Sphira is a Keter. So first we have one big Keter, then we have 10 Keters. And if you have 10 kings that vie for each one having a separate crown, that's no good either. That doesn't produce creative relationships of the type that can foster a world of exchanges. So it breaks. And this is how the sparks entered into the klipot, or the shells of the worlds. These are the sparks of primordial worlds that historically were invalid. And in Kabbalah, it's stated that the destruction of these worlds was a necessity, because what it does is it puts little sparks of primordiality in the relationships that were then created by Bohu in the world of structure that we know, which is conceptualized structure, which is order, which is structure that can be applied to that Saturnian function of functional limitations, right? So in the world that makes sense to us are these little pieces of incomprehensibility from the tohu, right? And those are the sparks that are raised out of the shells. They also create the shells, but that's another matter altogether. So getting back to the main point, if you have tohu, which is a continuous state of structurelessness in a dynamic, creative sense, that has to reconcile with the ability for space to appear structurally. And these two principles seem like opposites. You have tohu and bohu, structurelessness and the appearance of structure. If you go back to the original paradox of the Or Ein Sof, which is open possibility and the presentation of the mirror and its capacity for endless relationships, and if you just view tohu and bohu as that paradox, you see that structure and structurelessness equalize with each other on a level beyond the mind's logic. That's a mystical realization, because the normal habits and tendencies of the mind tear those two principles apart from each other and hold them up as opposites. And this is where I depart from Lurianic Kabbalah. Lurianic Kabbalah strictly sees tohu and bohu as part of that primordial world of sparks that fall down into what was created. They view it as a proto-history. I view it as an eternal paradox that is always with us. It's the nature of your own mind. It's the nature of your reality, tohu and bohu. Your structure is structureless. How about
Wow.
that?
Wow. Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
Now, when you draw this into the actual midot, or the attributes of the sphirot, this becomes Chokmah and Bina,
Mhm.
because each one of those sphirot can function either way. Chokmah can be the chashmal, undifferentiated structureless potency, but at the same time, that force appears in degrees of life force and degrees of mind in our awakening. So it can be whole or fragmentary. And the same thing with Bina. Bina's the lamp of darkness. It's pure, blazing space. But at the same time, it's also that Saturnian function, which sets limits for all the structures to abide by. So, what's the true Chokmah and Bina? Is it the limited one or the unlimited one? Well, it's the paradox. And if we take that paradox back to the root, which is Or En Sof, openness that presents itself with no contradiction. If we cut to the divine, we're always solving all the problems. And the divine is essentially a living paradox.
Mm.
So the part of the diagram on the left side below is an image of that sacrifice that we were talking before. We equalize Teli and Galgal, Keter and Malkut, and ultimately they meet the pure paradox of Chokmah and Bina as Tohu and Bohu. And I have Tohu and Bohu written on the side, but it's essentially an equalization of the sun and moon.
Yeah, and you've got what's interesting here too is talking about the eternal paradox. You've got a yin yang thing going on right here, where you've got the solar disk there with the lunar crescent inside of it, and then you've got the lunar crescent here with the solar disk inside of it. So yeah, it's representative of the fact that these things are, not in. There's a paradox there.
Yeah, I want to stress the paradox and not go. I mean, I might as well mention it because you brought it up. I do something that's considered a little bit weird with the sun and the moon, that in my system, the moon is the male principle, the Chokmah aspect, and the sun is the female principle. Usually it's reversed for
Hmm.
most systems. That comes from my time essentially digesting tantric vajrayana and working that way. But it makes a certain kind of sense, because when we describe Chokmah as that mirror-like reflective principle, that's the moon.
Mm.
See, that's why I
Yeah.
hold that correspondence. And space itself, as Bina, is blazing with its nothingness.
Yeah. Yeah. Radiant nothingness.
Now, keep in mind, all correspondences are relative, and there is no correct correspondences.
Yeah.
So the
Yep.
fact that I do this with the sun and the moon doesn't amount to a hill of beans if somebody, explains it a different way. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Because to be married to your correspondences, there is nothing more depressing than seeing two occultists arguing at a party over whose correspondences are correct.
I didn't, and I didn't realize that in 2026 there were any occultists that
That
engaged
cared
that,
enough to argue?
or really, or really just like met each other outside of the internet.
No, because they're all at home in their underwear in their parents' basement, right?
Yeah, leaving comments on nasty comments on certain videos, but
Yeah,
y
fuck you, man.
this guy doesn't know what it's all about. I don't, he doesn't. You've got to, you work the with crystals and things of that nature. It's like, you know, and that's what's so important about the conversations that I think we're trying to have. You and I and everybody else that you and I talk to, you've done a lot of sort of interviews lately and sort of bridging and branching out there to try and bring quite a bit of maturity to an environment that is kind of stuck in its own relationship to the material. and I find that in the world is happening. Everyone is becoming obsessed with their relationship to their perceptions. I could conceive of it as kind of like this. Actually, a friend of mine had a beautiful analogy when we were going over some of the Platonic stuff. And it's, if you can imagine a rainbow, and everybody, a bunch of people on the ground seeing it, and they're all viewing it at a different angle, and they're all, so therefore they're describing it differently, and none of them are necessarily wrong, but they're not getting to the capital R reality, if such a thing could be said, or the higher essence of the rainbow, because they are stuck in their
Hmm.
relationship to it.
You remember in that first diagram, I had the point that became the dualism of the circle and the line. And I said that one thing that happens with that Cartesian mentality is you fall into the rigidity of point of view, which is singular. It's always singular. It's exactly what you're talking about, is being rigidly locked into point of view. That's what we're fighting against, right? Because the point that swallows everything can't be conceptualized or localized within a set of relationships or explanations. It's beyond all of that. It's interesting that you said that I've been doing interviews recently. I've always wanted to. I've always tried to. It was difficult living in retreat. I think my problem is I didn't know how. I still don't know how. I mean, other than the little handful of people that I talk to, like you, I know you, so I can talk to you, but I would love to do things. It's like I've got a good friend who's a famous musician and composer, and we were talking about another contemporary of his from the 80s and how he's not commercially successful. And he made this great statement. He said, he tried to sell out, he just didn't know how. That's me, I tried to sell out, I just didn't know how.
Yeah. Yeah, well, as they say, when the student is ready, the master appears. And I think it's probably a good sign that you're getting out there. And not to gush at all, but you've always had cred where it counts, man. I mean, everybody that I've spoken to, that I hold in high esteem, they all know your work and they all regard it extremely highly. I mean, I've gone as far as, parts of Europe where people were like extremely excited. They were talking about some of the videos that we did, so it's, you've got a lot of people out there that really respect you, I think, in the right places, and the right people are talking about it. But yeah, I mean, I think that you should continue to branch out, and these video series I think are super important, because
I would love to.
I don't know that you could, like, I don't know that it would be appropriate to go on like a podcast and do this, which is why we've kind of taken it out of that format. But
Mm.
this
Who
video,
is to say? Who knows?
yeah, absolutely. But it's
Yeah.
it's certainly just taking the initiative to set stuff up like this. I think also helps get people acclimated to your philosophy, because I can't tell if I'm ripening to it, or if you've gotten better at describing this.
Well, I'll say one thing that occultists can benefit from, and I appreciate very much everything that you're saying. One component that seems missing in Western occultism, especially where magic is concerned, is this emotional register, the devotional part of the work, right? The part of the work that falls so deeply in love that it becomes almost absurd to be rigid, you know. And uptightness and rigidity is the enemy, because it takes your correspondences as a set of prison bars, prison walls, you know. And the way out of that prison, I think, is largely emotional and not intellectual. I mean, they have to work together, obviously, that you should understand the reasons why the rigidity of small minded thinking do the job. You need to understand that intellectually, but moreover than that, I think you have to feel it emotionally. And this is where Hod and Netzach do their work. Hod and Netzach are generally referred to as like the wheels of the chariot, that keep the vehicle moving. And they're really powers of thinking and feeling. And what happens with a lot of occultists is on the feeling end, you question sort of what they're feeling and why, what the purpose of the work is on a psycho-emotional kind of level. And I think that to defer to Gevura for a lot of people produces a certain style of rigidity. And the answer is deferring to Chesed, deferring to the benevolence that becomes awesome after the fact, And a lot of that, I think, and I say this from the experience of my own life, but also because I think it would benefit from people. I think if you've never truly loved, you can't practice.
Yeah, I would agree with that entirely.
And there's a level of poetic permeability that allows you to use symbols in a new way through love, through the emotionality, the intensity of how the primordial fire, that structureless fire, the formless fire, Ike Baker, that formless fire, if it is not drawn through every level, which includes your emotions, you are going to have a sterile version of it. That in order for it to literally be everything and to throw everything into the fire, there's a certain aspect of it which has to overcome your emotions. And people are not generally ready for what happens. I sure wasn't. That I thought that I knew what things like this might have meant until I got tastes of it, and those tastes were devastating because it's not just mommy, daddy, poo poo, childhood kind of like, Freudian version. It's the purpose of your life and what you secretly longed for when you were 7 years old, and your spouse, and what happens after you die. If the sum total of your psyche is not involved, and that's a very emotional thing for a human being, to reconcile the purpose of your life and your ultimate demise. That's what's on the table. To pretend that it's otherwise is like fantasy land.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, what's on the table is the sum total of your living. And if that doesn't floor you, I don't know what will.
Mm.
And to give it all up purposefully, and not just like let nature take its course. I'm not going to look into it. It's not for me. Like, and I would say if anybody gets curious about this, hang out with some old people.
Yeah, I was lucky because when I was applying to school for physical therapy, before I switched gears and did Chinese medicine. I had to get a certain amount of observation hours, and the place where I got my hours, it was a lot. It was a lot of hours, but was an in-pair. I mean, an inpatient senior care rehabilitation center, and so I was for a long while. I was around elderly people, and it really changed the way I looked at the world over a certain period of time, because of not just the wisdom, but it seems like they had clarity.
Sometimes it's the opposite.
Dementia. Some of them had dementia. Yes, that's true too. But some of them were there because they had bad knees. So
Well, with really, really old people who do not have clinical dementia, very often they're either really, really nice or really, really mean or really, really spaced out.
yeah.
They're not like us.
Well, I mean, what you just described, really, really nice, really, really mean, and really, really spaced out. I mean, that's morning, afternoon, and evening for me.
Yeah, right. Or some mixture of the two. But the thing is that these are the people who are backed into the corner to face their own death. And really, that's everybody. But we conveniently occupy ourselves with the circumstances on the table and don't acknowledge the truly mind blowing and truly sad and poignant poetry of the unanswered questions of our own life. And that's what fuels what you're talking about. Like when you're saying that my work presses these buttons, that's the button, you know,
Yeah.
the mirror like structurelessness of your own mind, the idea that there is an unborn capacity for awareness that cannot die. It is unborn and cannot die. And that is the divine aspect of your consciousness. As soon as you get excited about that, you have to immediately turn around and say to yourself, well, everything else is going to die and I'm going to lose it. Well, that's devastating. I mean, I can't stop thinking about this.
Yeah, me neither.
And it's very, very painful.
It is. And, you know, sometimes, and I'm saying this as a maybe, that's something that might, if not now, become eventually relatable to anyone that's listening. It can sometimes baffle the people around you that love you that don't practice. It's just like, why are you constantly thinking about death? Why does the conversation, if we're considering something, like another thing, like I just look at everything I love, all of it, not even just people or animals, but I look at the little joys of lying in the grass, and having that smell, and like it's all going to go, and that makes me very sad. But and that's, as you say, that button that people are going to automatically reject. I don't want to have to do this. But what I've learned recently, I spoke to you recently. I'm not going to go into personal details, but I had a very devastating experience happen about a month or two ago. And one of the ways which I have found immense healing at an exponential rate, actually, believe it or not, is by really, really feeling that pain and not just getting over it, but taking it with me, and not suckering it, not nurturing it, that so that it becomes this dark cloud that follows me, but trying to understand it, and allow myself to see what part it plays in the nature of my being.
And if that's not enough, and if that's not sufficient, then we have to reconcile that the entire world has gone crazy.
Yeah, exactly.
So, like, any little piece of this is enough to drive you insane. The sum total of it is too much. Is too much. That to be facing the crazy incomprehensible prospect of losing everything in a world that is crazy and defines itself as crazy and commits itself to its insanity every moment with new evidence of its craziness.
Yeah,
Unrelenting.
doubling down.
Yeah, always you can count on that. You could count on more bad news today. You think you're going to get some good news eventually?
Yeah.
Maybe one will sneak in every now and then, but
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, what better time than now to just focus on your
that's right.
practice?
So people say like living in retreat, and I have got a very interesting story about living in retreat and how I've done it. It's kind of not the usual one, but I never viewed really having much of a choice because the alternative was just rubbing my face in the misery of living a crazy life in a crazy world. And it just seemed so unappealing. Like, what the hell else am I going to do that makes any kind of sense? Of course, I'm going to live in retreat because I'm lucky enough to be in a a position where I don't have any responsibilities, like not really worldly responsibilities. I don't have children, you know, and I chose that because I glimpsed this very early on that if you're going to live in the world, you can't really do certain things, you know. So since the world is only going in a very specific direction, that I really have a lot of problems with joining that direction. So opt out, you know, it was sanity to me.
Yeah, I agree with you.
However,
As somebody who has tethered themselves to the hull of the sinking ship.
yeah, now opting out is not problem free either, because there were some things that happened to me in retreat that were indelible damage done to my psyche. And you don't get something for nothing, you know. So when you live in retreat and you make that trade-off, you deal with an aspect of what we could call psychological alienation that produces a kind of a damage. You know, I did a 3-year retreat, silent retreat, solitary, and and I came out of it with some stuff, you know, some problems that I didn't have before. And that was the trade-off. And I knew it was the trade-off. It's not like I became mentally ill, you know, organically as people do. No, this is something I did to myself. You know, I made the decision and it was a trade-off. I didn't know it at the time that this would be the case, but yeah, it hurts your mind to be in isolation. And you see this of people put in solitary in federal penitentiaries, that they come out, they're fucked up. You know, there's a certain aspect of that that happens to retreat, even though you might have really good food in a really comfortable place. You know, no one trying to knife you, for example. That's
I
a
don't know
plus.
if you definitely have a lot of blessings, because if I told Nicole I was going into retreat, she'd probably knife me.
Well, you know, why do these things happen? Nobody knows why people get dealt the hand that they get dealt with, right? But I'll tell you one thing that people can say for sure is they can tell you when they've blown it.
Yeah.
Like they were given a possibility and they fucked it up. Everybody knows if they fucked it up. Yeah, me too. I mean, my whole well, more than half my life up until 42 years old was one series of fuck ups after another. And I'm 62 now.
Mm.
So I've had 20 years of, you know, constructive work. But before that, it was like the worst train wreck you ever saw in your life in New York in the 70s.
Oh no, none of that for me, thank you. But and that's for anybody listening, right? I mean, it's no joke when they call this kind of stuff the pearl of great price. It's not, it's not free pearl, it's something that there's always, an exchange, right? And again, that ties into sacrifice. Really, I mean, it's maybe it was less of a sacrifice for you than it would be for somebody who didn't have a crazy life, but certainly you sacrificed a lot of things.
Well, what happens when you have any, even like a little spark of recognition that awareness is that structureless, open dynamism, right? Once you've tasted that, what happens to the rest of the patterns in your psyche? Well, they, to a certain extent, start to kind of shake and wither and tremble a little bit from the impact of the confluence, because before that point of recognition, you didn't know what you didn't know. So once you go through this, and this happens in retreat in a very accelerated way, once you have sparks of this taste, the rest of your psychological patterns are shaking. And in that shakeup, it's very uncomfortable and very painful. And this is one reason why a very good thing to do is inflate your dot. Because if you keep contemplative learning and exploring to exaggerate that conceptual function as esotericists do, you're actually giving your ruach, you're giving your psyche something to do that resonates with the breakthrough experiences that you've had. And that is a process of self-correction. And so there's a necessity to do some sort of turbocharged conceptual aspect to your practice, even if it expresses non-conceptuality, especially if it expresses non-conceptuality. But there's no roadmap for this. So it doesn't go smoothly, we could say.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
So let's go to the next image.
Okay.
And see what we can talk about there. Okay. Here is an interesting thing that we should talk about. By now, some of this symbolism with the initial geometry we spoke about, with the circles and lines, and in the Lurianic texts, both the straight lines and the circular boundaries are designated by the term kav. So the kav is not just the straight line, although that's the primordial kav that enters into the circle of the tzimtzum. Both the periphery of every vessel and the line that goes into it, both the linear and circular sphirot, are called kav. So on the left, we have a diagram of a circle within a circle. And the interior circle is where we work out all the relative checks and balances that we've mentioned, reconciling it with the primordial paradox. But the ultimate greater circle that it functions within as a subset is designated here by the crown of Keter. That's the part that your psyche doesn't see. That's the part that you surrender into, which is beyond the capacities of the Ruach. It's beyond your personal vision. It involves an aspect of vision which is sort of invisible, we could say, totally intangible. And it really, it kind of requires a rather unhuman or transhuman, or I don't know what word to use here, a highly unusual sense of trust to surrender to something that you absolutely can't experience with your senses or think about with your mind. Something that is totally, totally beyond both whatever you can speculate about or grasp in any way. And to surrender into that mystery is really frightening because you don't know what you don't know, right? So that's the greater circle of infinity that surrounds the circles within circles within circles of relative life. And that's the position that we put ourselves in. Now, right above this construct is the root of so much of this symbolism that's taken from the Zohar. And this is really the first couple of lines of the first chapter of the Zohar, right after the introduction. And I carry it around with me on a card, and I'd like to just read it to you.
Sure.
In a translated form, because it answers all this geometry in a really kind of shocking way. And Zohar states, a lamp of darkness, a botzina de kardenuta, a lamp of darkness, flashed within the concealed of the concealed, from the head of Ein Sof. A cluster of ether forming in formlessness, thrust in a ring, as a cord surveyed. It yielded colors deep within the spark and gushed a flow of splaying colors, concealed of the mystery of Ein Sof. It split, but did not split its avira, its luminous ether, and was not known at all until, under the impact of splitting, a single point shown. Beyond that, nothing is known. So it is called Brachis in the beginning. So, on one level, an exoteric religious Jew or Christian could take this as a creation scenario of the Tzimtzum with a timeline. This is the proto history. This is how the point arose of creation. But the Zohar doesn't really say that, does it? The Zohar is giving you these poetic paradoxes where it's splitting but not splitting the endless potency of structurelessness, that we have three symbols that are being conveyed here, and I have them listed on top. We have that spark. We've got a cord with which the spark is drawn, and then a ring. This is the point and the line and the circle of geometry. But the Zohar isn't saying, first you get one and then it goes to the other and they sort of make a logical progression geometrically. The Zohar is mixing them all together almost as if they're all the same thing. And that's really important because the spark and the term lamp of darkness, Botsina de Cardenuta, lamp is just a poetic device. In Aramaic, you could interpret the word as spark, and you could interpret the word darkness as density, like so full of possibility that you can't even see anything. So it's dark. So it could be spark of absolute density, we could say. As a matter of fact, one translation that I like translates Botsina de Cardenuta as hard spark, that a spark that is so dense that it's impenetrable, right? So that spark has both this aspect of a cord for measuring or drawing forth, right? And a ring, and then within that, rings within rings within rings, right? But the Zohar puts it together. The Zohar could have easily made this comprehensible with just putting it in a few lines, but it doesn't on purpose, because we're meant to mix these symbols into a spark or a point that is also a line and is also a circle at the same time. And it's split, but did not split space into pieces. So on the one hand, it appears split, but on the other hand, nothing split. It appears to be everything, but it's actually nothing. That's the ether. That's the ether in a nutshell. So the interesting thing about it is that the three mother letters, Aleph, Mem, and Shin, which roughly have the elemental correspondence of water, fire, and air, right? They're all sort of mixed together and referenced in this passage, that there's a fluid aspect where things are fluidly like involved in a plasticity. It's certainly blazing. And it's also pointed out that it's atmospheric. So it's all of these qualities. Like you can't say it is just a fire and an air and a water in stages in relation to each other. They're mixed.
Right. Yeah. And even the letters themselves kind of evoke. They could be the etymological root for some reason, right? Because I mean, the term Shamaim, the fiery waters of
The heavens.
yeah, the heavens. That also is very interesting to me because there's this connotation of, the etheric nature of the of like it's fairly recent that we have a concept of complete void, like space as a vacuum, right? As you mentioned earlier, like there's this idea of the luminiferous ether, luminiferous, ferrous, right? Ferro, it's This means carrying, the light carrying ether, and it was supposed to be all permeating, through the heavens, through everything. So that's interesting to me. I've never really put that together with the three mothers and Shamayim. I could be reaching, but I don't know. What do you think?
What I think is two things. First of all, if you put these three tendencies together, I have the term written here that I like to use. It's an etheric fluid fire. And that etheric fluid fire is how we deal with the Ruach Elohim, which is its own fire and its own water, we could say. That's the primordial ether that we deal with in practice as the mind's phenomena, like you and I did a whole series on this. And that's very interesting because as that etheric fluid fire, and I'll get to the other part of what you just asked me in a minute, but as that primordial etheric fluid fire assumes the seemingly structural organizational principle of the Sphirot, it becomes the functions of the Sphirot, and this is what is articulated in the Fountain of Wisdom. And if you back up and look at that diagram on the right, what I've done is I've taken the Fountain of Wisdom's terms, poetic terms, for that etheric fluid fire and put them all into a tree form. That we have the question of translucency or opacity, that's your Keter. Then the dichotomy of continuous yet incrementally appearing with life force, and that blazing structurelessness, that's Chokmah. And then with Bina, open yet appearing enclosed. So we have the paradox inherent in the supernals. The phenomena of the etheric fluid fire pours out, produces intervals and impulses, conglomerates, makes relative trajectories and particularization with pieces, and all of that is combined in one etheric foam. And that foam is etheric as an atmosphere, but it's also fluid and blazing at the same time. So the Fountain of Wisdom is taking us one step further than the Zohar with this visionary insight into how the etheric fluid fire functions. That's the first thing. The second thing, to answer your question, with the symbolism involved in these esoteric systems and in the Bible, that has to do with containment. And I think you asked about the elements in relation to principles of the zodiac. One common view at the time was that the forces of the zodiac occupy a firmament, which is like a membranous skin between the terrestrial and the ideal realm. And what the Zohar is describing is the translucency between those levels through that firmament, we could say. If that makes sense.
It does. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I don't deal with a lot of the astrological stuff. So I think it would be very interesting to see what someone like Jamie would think about that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. He's another person that I regard to be absolutely brilliant. So maybe we can cajole him into joining us one day and do a little bit of a round table.
Hey, I'm up for that. So the tree on the right, as you can see, I'm using this model over and over again where Chokhmah and Bina, or the principles of Tohu and Bohu, create that circle of infinity. And the subset of that is the relative circle, or the circle of what we consider perceptually tangible parts of our experience, both internal and external, that is perceivable, or what we deal with experientially. And what the Fountain of Wisdom is telling us is that experientially, we could perceive phenomena as these visionary tendencies, where conglomeration of parts, where energies and enclosures and intervals mix together into this foam. The foam is where we do our work. The foam is the alchemical laboratory. The foam is essentially the interaction between our subjectivity and a world that we think of as objective. It's ultimately the supernal tendencies provide either the ability to make that phenomena transparent to its essence or opaque, which falls back on our habits. And like I said before, that's all based on the primordial paradox, that the Or Ein Sof is that paradox, open yet presentational at the same time. Amazing.
Yeah. Um, Again, my thoughts, my questions veer more towards, okay, the practical implications of this kind of stuff. And uh we've talked about paradox, and we talked about how, there is a trap in modern occultism, esotericism, magical practice, however you want to, whatever bracket term you want to use to describe these communities. There's a trap where people become unable to exist in this paradigm and the system which they're in. I'm interested to know if you have any, like, would you, in all honesty, would you recommend somebody breaking away from their tradition? Um, or do you think that you should follow a particular tradition to the point where you can then sort of understand it, master it, and move on to and I know that you don't speak for everybody because you do what you do and it's a very specific thing. But in conversation here, I'm wondering, like, what advice would you have for somebody who's, let's say, in a Golden Dawn or Aurum Solus or Martinist kind of paradigm, very very much um, rigid in their respective systems. Do you think that people should break out of that and go more contemplative? I mean, it's probably what some people who are listening are thinking.
I honestly have no idea what people should do. I really, really, truly don't, because um, the variables inside a person and what they're ultimately capable of cannot be known, because what a person can be is very often triggered by extreme circumstances. So you take a person who has a certain kind of life and you push them to the absolute limit. There's no telling what they could become. Nobody knows what a person's really capable of. But if that doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. So I really, really don't know, because you're talking about systems of esotericism which have certain um, um, very well known limitations of rigidity. But what about people in the religions or the esoteric branches of the religions? What about Orthodox Jews? What about Vajrayana practitioners? What about Sufi Muslims? What about Zoroastrians? I mean, who can say? So I really, really don't know what's good for people,
Mhm.
because I am not in a position where I have any kind of authority to know that. What happened to me only really pertains to me. And I
Mm.
couldn't say, do what I did or follow me.
Right. Yeah.
Because I'm not a realizer, like, guru type figure or
Mhm.
teacher of that type. I'm not a adherent to a particular system either.
Mhm.
I'm kind of like an explorer,
Mm.
right? And the way that I got to be that type of explorer was by doing several systems at the same time. So I couldn't give advice as to whether one system would work or not if you really adhered to it with your whole mind and heart, because I never did that. I always did it with several systems simultaneously. Like
Mm.
the one greatest period of acquiring knowledge and like theories and techniques in my development was a 10-year period in which I stopped doing visual art, I stopped creating anything, stopped writing anything, and dedicated myself to learning for 10 years and had a
Mhm.
series of teachers. But during that period, I was putting on a black hat and a black suit to study with Hasidim and then going to a tantric hermitage like like a week later and then coming back to Brooklyn and putting on the black hat and then getting back on the airplane and going out to the hermitage. So coming from Hermetic Kabbalah, going to Orthodox Jews and then to Tantrikas,
Yeah.
I didn't see these things as separate from each other. I saw them as the same thing.
Was there a particular uniform for the Vajrayana practice?
Yeah, the one I'm wearing now.
It makes me think of like action figures, like you know?
Well, you know that I wear the same clothes every day.
Yeah,
I've done this for over 20 years.
Yeah, that shirt where you've got all your pens lined up. It's great.
Yeah. This is not something that was spur of the moment. I've been doing this, for a very long time, and the only reason is because I like the pockets. I like the way my it's got the right kind of pocket, so I don't have to think about. People say, well, why green? I don't know. Green. Is it green? I didn't notice. But yeah, when I was doing the learning thing and I would go into, for example, a Hasidic study room, and study with the people who were teaching me, I had to take the position that if I was there with those people, I was all in. It's not like I was saying, hey, this is like that concept in Tantra that I learned. No. You're all in wherever you are. And that's what worked for me. Because each one of these things has a ring around it, like the Zohar is describing. It's got a boundary. It's like in a laboratory where you're making cultures of bacterium, and you have in the petri dish an antibiotic ring around the rim so the bacteria can't climb out. That's me. And when I was doing this, I realized I don't know anything. I want to learn something. And if this is my opportunity now, I'm not here to do cross-referencing to be Joseph Campbell, combining these different things. I'm here to learn what this guy's talking about.
Yeah.
I think that's it.
Well, you see, and I think that description, though you've clarified that's what worked for you, I think that's extremely valuable for people to hear. That will definitely land it has to land in some form of fertile soil of someone's mind, because that's extremely good advice in terms of, even though it's not technically advice. I mean, I've experienced the same thing. Only the last, I want to say maybe 6 years or so, I was very much rigid and sort of trapped in the identity of Golden Dawn initiate, practitioner, so on and so forth. And I broke out of that shell through emotionality. Actually, the emotions, as you were mentioning earlier, I kind of broke down that rigidity in various stages and types of emotion, but the way that I'm able to systematize or really synthesize stuff is because when I'm, when you and I are having phone calls or something like that, or when I'm in the Golden Dawn Temple, or when I'm studying alchemy with somebody, I'm like completely, it's as if, the other stuff that I do is, it doesn't interfere. I'm keeping the food separate on the plate and investing in what I'm trying to learn or understand.
Well, here's something that, since we're in this advice section, here's something pretty important for me to say. When you break the rules of a system, you have to be extremely careful and expert at the implications of what you're doing. Because if a certain system that you're involved in has a rule that you must not, for example, go to any other system, and that maybe that system has to be exclusive. If you make a pledge and that's the rules of that particular system, you really should consider not breaking the rules unless you have a really well thought out plan and reason for doing so that you're willing to accept the consequences of. So, for example, when I was studying with the Hasidim, they have quite a few rules that I had to break. And I had to really consider what the implications of that gamble was going to be. Because if I'm only interested in this one thing that they're offering, and yet there's all these other things attached to it, and I'm going to break that rule, I better be pretty damn sure that I know what I'm doing. Otherwise, it's going to destroy the entire thing. Or you have the permission of the system to do that. So it's not a good idea to combine systems or break out of systems in an irresponsible way that is unconsidered, that is based on your whims and impulses and intuitions. Your intuitions are not sufficient to rely upon to do this. It has to go beyond that. For example, when I was studying with Hasidim, I had a particularly open-minded rabbi. And I told him, look, I'm going to the Tantric Hermitage. I know what you think of that work. Your opinion of it is not a high opinion, let's say. Drinking out of human skulls, and you don't like that, I know. But that's kind of what I'm doing, and I'm a package deal. So I was open about it, and I didn't hide anything. That was a good move. Because every rule that I broke, I had someone to talk to who knew more than I did about it. And I could check it out and be responsible about it. Because this haunted me, this idea that I'm doing all this work. I could be taking 2 steps forward and fucking it up 5 steps back if I don't really know what I'm doing. And I can't know what I'm doing. So I had to talk to people about it and trust them.
Yeah. Well, that's very good advice. I mean, honestly, I like the fact that you're bringing in responsibility into this stuff, because a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, you're being led down a dark alley. You don't know where you're going.
Right. Right. Yeah. But I mean, a lot of people think that, I've seen, at least practically, I've seen people get involved in esoteric orders and esoteric speculation and learning. And they think somehow just in that mere engagement, they're transcending things like this, the very basic stuff that you're talking about now. It's like, no, I mean, I keep an open mind. I know Kabbalah. I'm interested in astrology, transpersonal psychology. What I can kind of be a little flaky. Now, I'm not saying that's the actual inner monologue, but it's the way people behave in these communities in the modern day. So I think it's very, very important. All this is just to emphasize exactly what you said there, is that you should do things responsibly for exactly the reasons that you said.
When you're in the learning stage, when you're in the student stage, you absolutely have to take the point of view that you don't know nothing and that your judgment is horrible and is going to be horrible. What allowed me to get good at this was having come from a life where I was a fuck up. So I knew I was a fuck up. I knew I couldn't rely on my own judgment. It was a load off of my shoulders, really, because I knew I better take somebody else's point of view rather than rely on my own, because mine is so unquestioningly bad that that to operate under the assumption that I know what I'm doing would just be pure folly. So for me, it was easy. Also, the other thing that helped me a lot was having an attitude where I really deeply, on a fundamental gut level, felt I had nothing to lose. So if I lost it all, I didn't care. That was crucial, because then I could throw myself in and I wasn't holding back, because what am I protecting? I'm an idiot. Being an idiot was the missing ingredient.
Yeah. Well, and there's a humility to that too,
The dangerous idiot. It's a great position to be in. Like if you are, it's like the Fool card of the tarot. You're dancing on the edge of a cliff. Whee! Hey, who the fuck cares what happens? And that's what it takes. Nothing to lose. He's an idiot. He's a fool. He's on the edge of a cliff, but you don't know what the implications of that move are going to be. Could be everything. It could be nothing. Could be catastrophe. It could be total accomplishment, you know, and anything can happen. So you don't want to take that status exclusively. It's a series of checks and balances with the discipline of being extremely diligent about your follow-up. So it's the combination of those two things. However, having said that, and this directly answers your question, if somebody suspects that the system that they're in has too rigid a grasp on its internal logic, and what will benefit them is another perspective outside of that logic, what they have to look at is the system's claims at authority. Like if your system is telling you, this is the way that we do it, these are the correspondences and rituals and methods that we're giving you, they're correct. If a system is claiming that its material is correct, upon what authority does it make that assumption? There could be several reasons why they think that. It could be because of the realization of the founders of the system. It could be because this is a revealed truth connected to a religion, which is a big one. Or it could be maybe they don't know. Maybe this is just what they ended up with and this is what they got. So they're getting very high and mighty about, putting out what they got. So you got to look into the source of the authority and question it. Nothing wrong with questioning it.
No. Excellent. That's excellent advice. Thank you for wagering an answer.
Like if you sat in a room with Mathers and Westcott and maybe Waite was in there.
Oh, God.
What are you going to ask these guys?
I probably for Waite, I'd probably be like, is your underwear too tight?
Yeah. Can you wait out in the hall?
Yeah, exactly.
Arthur.
Can you wait out in the hall? That would be what I would ask.
Yeah. So you got Mathers and Westcott sitting there, and you get a chance to grill them. And the question is, upon what authority? Like, do you actually believe in the secret chief stuff, you guys?
Yeah, I think Mathers did, but it's because I when I see and again it's just pure speculation, but when I look at Mathers's the things that he said, the way that he spoke, he was brilliant, but also like nuts. So he was very much, and he could be very credulous. I mean, let's not forget the Horos scandal. So I'm. It's just interesting to me. Whereas in Westcott, I see somebody that's more measured and calculating. But yeah, that would definitely be one of the questions. It'd be like,
well, the other two possibilities, which is that a lineage or an order is based on the realization of somebody who's accomplished something with their gnosis, right? Mm-hmm. That is something that you'll never know what's in the mind of another person, especially if they're not there with you to check out. Very often you have their writings or what they've created. That's one model. The other model is that the authority of a system comes from some revealed truth. Mm-hmm. And that's the way it is, for example, in Hasidus, the revealed truth of the Torah. It's Judaism. It's a religion. Why is any of it valid? Because they've got that narrative that they trust. They're Orthodox Jews. Well, if you don't believe in Orthodox Judaism, that's out the window. Like you can't do anything with that. And that's the position I was in because I didn't believe that even one infinitesimal quark of a degree. I think that's fantasy land and I don't care. So at that point, I'm just saying, what do you got? And what they have was a lot. So I knew I could cut loose the revealed truth of the religion, let it drift downstream. I don't need it. I don't even want to look at it. I don't care. But this other part, which was essentially devotional Lurianic Kabbalah, count me in. I want to learn that stuff. So their revealed truth, that was it. But in tantric lineages, for example, it's all the realization of the head of the lineage or whoever initiated the lineage. That's how lineages in many registers get started, with the realizer's realization. So you look at, for example, the great realizers of certain systems like Padmasambhava, right? Well, you could learn all about Padmasambhava and figure out whether you trust his realization or not, you
Mhm.
know, and you trace it back. So
Yeah.
that's part of how you do your due
Due
diligence, is
diligence.
looking at the authority of,
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
virtue of what do you give me this?
Right. Yeah. And that can be a scary thing, for people, because the we also, like, if you have not achieved any measure of realization, what do you base?
Yeah,
How
you're
are you?
taking a risk. You're taking a
ex-
huge risk.
Yeah, because you wouldn't know realization if you saw it. You have what's in your head, sure.
Well, then what you have to do is the best you can.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you have to take a risk, and it's a gamble. But, and this is where that thing about not having anything to lose really helped me out, because I took a lot of gambles with a lot of Meshuggah groups, and I don't even want to get into that, because there's stuff in my past. I don't even want to tell those stories.
Hmm.
But in the end, I think just about everything I did became a valuable piece. I don't think I wasted my time at all, even in the most dead end scenarios. And really, when it comes down to it, I don't know how my development amalgamated the material. I didn't do it consciously, and it wasn't done to me from the outside. I really just don't know how
Yeah.
it all came together.
Yeah, those are the best stories anyway, It's like there's kind of no logical chain of causality. It's just it's a paradox.
Well, in the early days, what did I have available to me? In the early days, it was kind of the same thing that everybody else has available to them. It was Golden Dawn and OTO, and various versions of that, whatever they might be. For me, it was SRIA and other things, and so that's what I had. I didn't have other options. Those were the options. So you make use of them, you get what you can, and if when you hit a wall, you move on.